Let's learn how to knit. Whether you're a complete beginner looking to take up a new hobby, or maybe you'd like to rekindle some fond but distant memories that you have of knitting in the past, this video tutorial is going to cover the 4 fundamental aspects of knitting for complete beginners. I'll be teaching you how to cast on, knit, purl and bind off. So grab some needles and some yarn and let's get knitting. Hello and welcome to the Crimson Stitchery, a video channel about making all things beautiful and useful. My name is Anushka, and over the last couple of years on YouTube, I've been really enjoying sharing all of my exploits in knitting and making in general. You can find me elsewhere online as The Crimson Stitchery, and do click into the down bar here on YouTube to find relevant links for things that I mention in this video. I've been knitting for about 16 years now, and I have distinct memories of learning how to knit when I was a teenager. When I was a kid, I definitely didn't have the patience for it, but after I got a little bit older, something just clicked. And whilst my first knitting projects certainly weren't that pretty, knitting definitely teaches you the virtue of patience and dedication, because if you just keep practicing, you will get better. Knitting is definitely not hard, and by its nature, it's extremely repetitive. So there's really no better time than the present to have a go at developing your knitting skills, and let's get knitting. In this video, I will be demonstrating how to cast on using the long tail cast on, the knit stitch and the purl stitch. I'll talk about the 2 key basic fabrics that you'll be producing, which are garter stitch and stocking stitch, also known as stockinette. And then at the end, I'll show you how to do a simple bind off to close the knitting. I will be demonstrating each technique several times and annotating it as well. So whatever your learning style, hopefully you'll find something that works for you. I've just grabbed a pair of knitting needles and suitable yarn from what I had lying around at home. I've gone for bamboo knitting needles, which I do recommend for beginners because wooden and bamboo textures of needles are not very slippery, which allows you to have a little bit more control over your yarn. And I've gone for Aran or a worsted weight yarn, and I'm pairing that with the recommended needle size for this yarn thickness, which is about 4.5 or 5 millimeters. With all that said and done, let's have a little bit less talk, a little bit more action, and let's get knitting. We will begin with the long tail cast on. There are lots of different types of cast on methods, and most of them start with a slip knot. So we've got the main length of our yarn that's attached to the ball on the left, and I've got the end of the yarn coming over to my right. So I'm starting off by pinching the yarn at the place where I'm going to be working my slip knot. So where my finger is literally pinching it, that's going to be the top of the knot. I'm just kind of tidying up by holding both lengths of yarn in my right hand, and I'm just twisting it over. Then, using my forefinger, I'm reaching through that loop and I'm grabbing the end of the yarn and pulling it through, like so. That's our slip knot. So if I then pull the end of the yarn, the knot will come undone, like so. Got the end of the yarn on my right, the length attached to the ball on my left. Going in the middle, twisting it across, pinching and pulling it through. And I'm just gently tugging on either end of the yarn in order to secure it as I do that. And then in order to make the slip knot smaller, I'm pulling the end of my yarn. You can see that makes it smaller. And I'll just tug on the other side of the knot in order to make it bigger. And I'll just demonstrate pulling the end of yarn to make it smaller. And that's it. And then we take our knitting needle and put the slip knot on the knitting needle. I've placed the slip knot on the needle with the loose end of the yarn at the front coming towards me, because I'm going to be working with my working yarn. So the length of yarn that's attached to the ball is called the working yarn. So I'm having that at the back. Tug that end of yarn in order to make it come snug on the needle. We don't want to pull it too tight or it will kind of choke the needle, which is going to make it difficult to knit with in the future. But we don't want it too loose. If it's too loose, like that, it's just gonna slip off way too easily. But that's fine, we can just put it back on the needle and just gently tug it closed like so. Let's work the long tail cast on. This is the method that was taught to me that I've ended up relying on. So it's called the long tail cast on because you need to have a very long tail or end of yarn, because you're actually going to be working this end of yarn into the cast on itself. So the end of the yarn has a very clear function in this cast on. So how much yarn to leave at the beginning? There's different approaches that you could take. There's a very rough rule of thumb, which is that the length of the long tail after the slip knot should be 3 times the width of the piece of knitting that you're going to be working on, right? So if we've got a 10 centimetre or 4-inch width of knitting, a very small little piece of knitting, then we would want to leave roughly a 30 centimetre or 1 foot, 12-inch length of yarn below our slip knot for the long tail. You probably want to add a little bit extra as well, just be generous. But if you can't be bothered with these kinds of calculations, just have a very long piece of yarn below the slip knot and just simply trim it off at the end, trim off any excess, leaving about 10 centimetres or 4 inches of extra slack, because you never want to just trim off the end of yarn too close to the actual knitting, because that will risk it unravelling. So I'm going to leave about 1.5 foot, so about 45 centimetres. Now I've put the slip knot onto the knitting needle and I will tighten it. So as you can see, it's not choking the needle. There's quite a bit of room for manoeuvre. And I'm just keeping my ball of yarn to the left while I'm working the long tail cast on, but I'll just unwind a little bit. Now just make sure that it's very clear to you which end of yarn is attached to the ball and which isn't. And the reason for that is we are going to be creating stitches using both lengths of the yarn, but we want to make sure that the stitch that gets attached to the needle is the one that is still attached to the ball of yarn, because that is going to be the stronger part of the stitch. I'm going to be manipulating the yarn around my left hand. So just open out your hand, leave your thumb and forefinger loose and fold down the middle ring and little finger down like that. And then we've got this pinching action in the left hand. We're going to go in through the middle of the 2 loops of yarn. So I've got my 2 loops of yarn dangling from the needle, going in with my pincher. Then I'm going to open up the last 3 fingers on the outside and grip the 2 yarns in them. Okay, so I've got my pinching action going in between the 2 lengths of yarn, and my other 3 fingers are gripping both lengths of yarn. So I'll just show that one more time. And I'm doing this pinching, gripping action. I'm going in, then I'm folding and gripping the yarns. Okay, and we want to have a fairly firm hold on the yarn here. We don't want it to be too loose. Yeah, we want to have some kind of control. But again, you don't need to yank it really tight. You can see that's pulling it down with a lot of tension. We don't want that. Just be firm but gentle. So there we go. That's the main hand hold for the long tail cast on. Now let's get going with the actual cast on. So I'm going to be manipulating the needle with my right hand. You can see I'm holding it like I would hold a pen or a knife. So again, I'm using my whole hand to grip the knitting needle, like so. And I've got my pinchy thumb and forefinger just holding onto the slip knot, actually, as if I was going to be, writing. Okay, so I've got the yarn in my left hand, needle in my right hand. I bring it down, like so. Go underneath the loop around my thumb, go underneath that loop by my forefinger, and then pull it under the loop of my thumb, take my thumb out, pull it taut. Under, okay, then I'm going to pivot the needle across and go down in the middle of this loop around my thumb. My thumb comes out and I use my thumb to tighten, again, just like with the slip knot, using that strand there. Okay, so I've actually just cast on 2 stitches in the long tail cast on there. So I'll just go through that again. So we've got our pinchy going in the middle, and we've got our grippy on the end of our hand. Okay, so I've got this kind of diamond shape going on in my hand. So I will bring the needle down. And as I bring the needle down, I've essentially created 2 more loops, one around my thumb and one around my forefinger. Under that loop around my thumb, bring it across and then go under it from back to front. And then I've got that loop on my thumb there, pop the needle into it, bring it back towards me. Okay, then I can take my thumb out, and I'm actually just using my thumb to tuck under that tail of yarn and using my thumb to tighten it onto the needle. Under, under, through, off. So if you cast on a bunch of stitches and you're starting to get too close to the edge, just simply push them down a little bit. But you don't want your stitches to be too far down the needle, or you're not going to get a nice tension and you're not going to be able to control what you're doing. So you need to have this happy medium of having enough distance from the edge. You'll get the hang of it, don't worry, just have a go and see how it feels. If you push all of the stitches all the way down, you can immediately see that it's really difficult to manipulate this needle tip nicely and get a nice tension, right? It's just not happening. So we'll undo that one. And again, if you're just way too close up the top, you're just kind of getting in the way of yourself and you're risking the stitches fall off almost as soon as you have made them. So we'll just get a happy medium going. I'm about an inch and a half from the top, maybe about 3 or 4 centimetres, but you will get the right feel of this for you when you just have a go at doing it. So you can see that once you get into a flow of it, you can sync all of these actions up and it becomes very, very natural the way that you're doing it around the hand. Under, through, off, and then as you're taking it off, you're automatically tightening it again with the thumb. And don't tighten it too much. So here are all of our stitches. We can spread them out. We want to be able to spread them out easily, right? If it's too tight, if we're like yanking them across, then our cast on is going to be tensioned too tightly. And now I've got 20 stitches. So I've got a little bit of extra length here at the end. And like I said, you could just go in and snip that off, snip off the tail, definitely the tail, not the end attached to the yarn ball. So just be careful there. It's really, really easily done. It might sound silly, but believe you me, I've done it. Or if you don't want to cut it off for whatever reason, maybe you're just practicing and you're just intending on undoing the whole thing. This isn't a finished piece of knitting. What I tend to like to do is I just fold it up and I just tie a basic knot. That gets the excess out of the way and it also marks it for me so that I know not to use this length of yarn. This is the wrong one to use to knit with because it's got the knot in it. And that's the long tail cast on. Now that we've cast on our stitches, we need to knit them. There are tons of different ways of knitting. I'm going to be demonstrating the method where you actually hold the yarn in the right hand, which is known as English knitting. However, knitting is pretty ambidextrous. So because I'm going to be holding it into the right hand, I'll move my yarn across there and I'll just push it off to the side and unravel a little length so that we're good to go. Sometimes it's nice just to unravel a little bit of length to make things easier. I'm going to be knitting, holding the yarn in my right hand. So I've got one needle in each hand, as you can see. And when we're knitting, we have the stitches on the left-hand needle. We knit through the stitches one by one and transfer them onto the right-hand needle. We're using the working yarn, which is attached to the ball. And as you can see, I'm holding and gripping the yarn using the bottom 3 fingers, just like the long tail cast on. And I'm already pinching and manipulating the needle using my thumb and forefinger as if I was holding a pen. So I'm using all of my fingers and the whole of my hand, as much of the muscle as possible. So I'll just start by moving the stitches a little bit closer to the tip of the needle. Again, you don't want it too close to the tip because they'll just fall off way too easily. But you don't want them too far down because just like with the long tail cast on, having them too far away from the edge is also going to mess up your tension because it's going to be harder to manipulate everything. So I'm holding the working yarn and the working needle in my right hand, and I'm going in from the front to the back and from the left to the right. So I'm going into that loop. My working yarn needs to be at the back. Taking the working yarn and I'm going around in an anti-clockwise motion. I'm wrapping it around the working needle. So remember that the working needle is the right hand needle. It's currently empty. And then I'm holding the yarn together with the working needle and I'm bringing the needle from the back to the front. And now I've got one stitch. Now I'm pushing off that old stitch and I've got my first stitch. We'll do the same thing. From front to back, left to right, insert the needle underneath the next stitch on the needle. Got a working yarn, wrap it around from back to front, holding my working needle. Now I've got to push my working needle from the back to the front. Okay, so I can use my forefinger here to help push it to the front. Now it's at the front. I can push off that old stitch. 2 stitches knitted. I'll talk through it one more time. So, got my stitches on the left needle. I've got my working needle and my working yarn in the right hand. Insert the needle from front to back and from left to right. Insert it underneath that top stitch. Take the working yarn, wrap it anti-clockwise, and then back round to the right, so I've wrapped it. Now my needle is in this cross shape. I need to bring my working needle to the front, so I'm pushing it with my forefinger, bringing it to the front, and then using my right hand needle, my working needle, I'm pushing off that old stitch in order to complete it. I'm just pushing up my stitches a little bit on the left hand needle so that they get closer to the tip again, like we talked about before. So as you can see, I'm using the 4 fingers on both hands as well to help me manipulate the stitches and move the yarn around. One more left. And there we have it. That's our very first row of knitting. If we just pull the fabric down, you can see these little tiny V's. Those are the old stitches. They're actually the cast on stitches. And our new stitches are the ones that are on the needle. So now we've got a new line of knitting in the right and an empty needle on the left. We need to swap them around. So when we switched hands, we actually turned the fabric around. So now we're basically knitting onto the back of the fabric. When we look at the stitches up close, we don't see little V's. We see the backs of the stitches. So it's as if it's the back of a collar. If you think about a jacket with a collar and lapels, we have the V of a blazer, or maybe it's a scarf that's been wrapped around someone's neck. And that is the back of the neck there with the little bumps. We've got stitches on the left, an empty needle on the right. Let's knit our second row. Here I hadn't actually finished knitting a stitch and I unwound that yarn. So if you find yourself in this kind of situation where your needles are still kind of attached, that's because you haven't pushed off that old stitch. Now I've pushed it off and I've got all of this space in between the 2 needles. Obviously, if you need to stop and go somewhere, ideally you would wait until you had knit all of the stitches on the needles, and then you would go off and do your thing, leaving one empty needle and one needle full of stitches, but sometimes life doesn't work out that way. So if you come back to your project and you've just left it like this and you don't really know what's going on, just have a look and think, are the needles kind of attached like this, or are they all free like this? And if it is free like this, that's because we've actually finished knitting an old stitch. You can see the V on the right there, and we need to knit some more stitches. And then that's my second row of knitting. So if I just pull the fabric down a little bit, you can see those little V's. This is my end of yarn from the long tail cast on. When you get to row 3, that's a classic time where you might accidentally pick up the length of yarn from the cast on instead of the working yarn. So just always make sure. So let's work row 3. We're making sure that we're not using the length of yarn from the cast on. So I'm actually just going to hold it together with everything else. Just going to grip it. Push those stitches to the top. You can see that I am stoppering the top of the knitting needle with my thumb and forefinger, right? So I'm not just holding it at the bottom and then pushing my stitches up so that I can knit them, because that way they might accidentally get pushed off. Okay, I'm just stoppering it there and pinching it, and then I'm slowly pushing them up with my thumb and forefinger. I'm actually doing in and out. And then I'm gripping the needle there. Okay, so this is, show you that hold one more time. Holding on there. Okay, holding on there with my thumb. Pushing up with my forefinger. Right, a lot of control there. And I'm using this forefinger to push up, and I'm using that forefinger to manipulate the yarn around. So just have a little practice of holding the yarn, tensioning the yarn with your hand and your forefingers. Now I'm really holding on quite firmly in the grip. If I do it really loosely, you can see actually it's harder to control it, but I'm holding on fairly firmly. I'm not pulling it tight, that's pulling it tight, and that's also difficult. Yeah, we just want to get a kind of happy medium with the yarn hold. This might feel a little bit weird at first, especially if you are brand new to knitting. There's probably a lot of new feelings in your hands. There's new muscle memory that's being awakened. I've been knitting for 16 years, so it feels quite natural to me at this point, but I can definitely remember how clunky everything felt and foreign at the beginning. So that's how you're feeling. If you feel like there's just so much going on and your hands, you know, just don't know how to hold on to everything at once, don't worry. You just need to keep going. Knitting is so repetitive. Already, as you've seen, we've got similar shapes, similar movements, and similar actions going on in both of our hands. Also, we're using a lot of our hand, right? Definitely more than as if we were just scrolling a smartphone or something like that. We're using, you know, lots of different muscles in our hands. And that's awakening connections in our brain and forming new neural pathways. So the more you keep going, honestly, the easier it's going to get. Keep knitting. So if you just keep knitting in this way, turning your work and doing the knit stitch, you're going to be creating garter stitch. This is our classic beginner's fabric. It's nice and bumpy, it's nice and flat, it's cushy, it doesn't curl or roll up, it's really comfy to wear. I think it's got this lovely retro feel to it, like the classic garter stitch scarf. As you can see, it's the same on the front and the back of the fabric. I like the fact that it's reversible and it's completely flat. It doesn't curl up at the edges or anything like that. And then we've got ridges of garter bumps, and then we've got the valleys in between, so it's very highly textured. If I hold it to the side, you can see the valleys. What you might recognise more as typical commercial knitted fabric is actually called stocking stitch, also known as stockinette. And in order to create this fabric, we actually need to learn one more stitch, which is purling. And purling is essentially the knit stitch, but backwards. When I was learning to knit, for some reason I thought that purling would be really difficult, and it really put me off. I don't know why I thought that, because it's not hard at all. And so that's why I'm going to be demonstrating how to purl in this beginner's knitting video, so that straight up you know what it is that you've got to do and you can just get on with practicing. So purling is basically knitting backwards because we're going to be working onto the wrong side of the fabric. So when we talk about fabric, we have a right side, which is the top side that you like to see. It's the outside of the fabric that you'd see if you were wearing a garment. And then we've got the wrong side, which would be the inside or the reverse side of the fabric that is kept at the bottom. It tends to be hidden away. So when we're purling, we're actually working onto the wrong side deliberately. So here, after I've worked my knit stitches, I've knitted across and I've turned it around. And if I was to knit back, I'd be creating another garter ridge because I've got these bumps, the collar, the back of the neck of the stitch at the front. But when I purl, as you'll be seeing shortly, I'm going to be doing the knit stitch backwards so that I'm actually creating stitches with the bumps facing me. So when I'm knitting, rather than having the V at the front and the bump at the back, when I'm purling, I'm actually going to be creating fabric with a bump at the front. So I'm going to be tensioning and holding the yarn in exactly the same way as normal. Now normally when I knit, remember I go in from left to right into the stitch or from front to back, like so. Then I wrap my stitch, pull it to the front, push it off. Okay, let's unknit that stitch. Let's purl. So instead I go from right to left or from back to front. And then the rest of it is more or less the same. I'm wrapping the working yarn round anti-clockwise. Now I'm pushing the stitch to the back and I'm casting the stitch off the left needle. And there we go. I've got my first purl stitch and you can see straight away I've got that little bump which is facing me as I'm knitting. Let me do a couple more. So putting the needle in from right to left, from back to front. So I'm crossing the other way, wrapping the yarn round the needle anti-clockwise. Now I'm pushing that needle to the back and casting the stitch off. Cast the stitch off. So everything else is the same. It's really not difficult at all, nothing to be afraid of. Everything else about the knitting process remains the same, it's just the other way around, right to left. Then anti-clockwise, and we push that stitch to the back, cast it off the left needle, the new stitch is on the right needle. So now that I've done a few purl stitches on my working needle, let me just turn it around for you so that you can see. And there we've got our V's. So now this is going to form the front of the fabric and it's going to become this smooth stocking stitch fabric because the back of the fabric has all of the bumps. All of the bumps are kept to one side, so it's different from the garter stitch, which you can see on the edge of this old sample that I've got here, this one that I made earlier. Here I've got garter stitch on the edge, so I'm knitting on one side, then on the other side, then on the other side, then on the other side, which created these ridges and valleys. But with stocking stitch, which is the main part, I've kept all of my V's on one side and all of the bumps, the purl bumps, on the back. And now I'm just going to go ahead and purl across. You can see quite clearly the knitting I did at the beginning and then the stocking stitch. Knit one row, then purl one row. And I'm going to keep going like this in order to create my stocking stitch. So now I'm knitting and I know to knit because I've got all of the V's, right? So I know that that's the knit side. So I'm going to be doing my knit stitch. Turn it around. So one thing about stocking stitch, which is our typical flat knit fabric, right, where all of the knits are on the right side and all of the purls are kept on the wrong side, is that it curls. It doesn't stay perfectly flat like garter stitch. It's just the nature of the fabric. Different stitches produce different fabrics and they've got completely different properties, so it's worth just playing around. So with stocking stitch, I'm knitting one full row and purling one full row because I'm working it flat. With garter stitch, I'm knitting all of the rows, front and back of the fabric. And there are all sorts of combinations of knit and purl. So if you do knit 1, purl 1, you'll produce a rib, or knit 2, purl 2, you'll produce a 2x2 rib. But stocking stitch on its own will curl up. The sides will roll up, the bottom and top will roll up. Exactly how and where the fabric rolls will be determined by the actual yarn that you're using, but stocking stitch is always going to roll. Trust me, I've tried lots of different workarounds, including blocking and so on and so forth, and it just wants to roll. So in order to prevent rolling, generally when you work stocking stitch, you need to have an edging, which is what I had in the sample that had the garter stitch edging. If I didn't have the garter stitch on the edge, the actual edge would start rolling up like a sausage roll or a Swiss roll. But with the garter stitch, at least I can keep the edge flat. This is just a tiny little sample. Just go ahead and practice doing the knit stitch, doing the purl stitch. Keep practicing until your tension is nice and even, which will mean that your stitches are all pretty much the same size, at least as visible to the naked eye. And the last thing to do is to close our piece of knitting and get it off our needles. And we do that by binding off. This is also called casting off. So especially in vintage patterns and in English knitting terminology from the UK, you have casting on and casting off, but these days we tend to say binding off instead of casting off. And binding off is the American terminology, but it's also really helpful when the terms are abbreviated because you have CO for cast on, so you're putting stitches onto the needle, like you're casting a spell, right? We're beginning something. But then to abbreviate closing off the stitches and ending the piece, you can have BO for binding off, not body odor. And that just makes it very clear in knitting patterns what it is that you're going to be doing. So I tend to say binding off. So like with nearly everything else in knitting, there are tons of different ways to bind off. There are different methods which produce different results. And I'm just going to show you the most basic and easy way of doing it, which is the basic knitted bind off. To do that, we'll first knit 2 stitches, just 2, 1, 2. So I've got 2 stitches on my working needle, which is the right needle. Then I'll use the left needle tip to go in underneath the first stitch that I knitted and pull it up over the second and pull it off the needle. And that's our first stitch bound off. So it does a little leapfrog. So I'll knit the next stitch, then using the left needle, I'll go underneath the first one that's on the needle, pull it over and off. Knit 1, bind 1 off. You want to do this nice and loosely. If you're finding it too hard to do it loosely, what you could actually do is replace your working needle with one that's a little bit bigger. So I'm going to get rid of my working needle now, and I'm just going to go for one that is several sizes larger. I remember that when I learnt to knit, my bind offs were really, really tight, and I really struggled to get a nice even bind off. So I'm just using this really big needle just to emphasize the fact that it doesn't matter how many sizes you go up, you just need to do what works for you. And that really is a theme that will run through your knitting practice, I hope. There are so many different ways of doing things. You know, it's not just that there's one method that is considered correct or that is considered authentic. There's loads of different ways to go about achieving the same results. It's definitely worth just picking one and sticking with it for a little bit, but being open to finding other ways of doing it too, so that eventually you can make a comparison and find what suits you, your hand shape, the length of your fingers, which hand is your dominant hand, and so on and so forth. So here I've just bound off a few stitches. Hopefully you can see how much looser the new ones are compared to the old ones. Maybe a little bit too loose, but you might need that, and so it's definitely okay just to do what it takes. And also you can see straight away that my stocking stitch fabric is rolling, like I said. Let's get to the end. If you actually find that your bind off is way too loose as it is, you can also go down a needle size. So now I've got one last stitch left. I could break the yarn and thread it through. I'm just going to open the stitch up now by pulling it, and I'm just actually gonna thread the end of the yarn that's attached to the ball through it, because again I'm not going to break the yarn because I've just created this little sample. And that's it. We've cast on, forming a slip knot, then doing the long tail cast on, We've practiced the knit stitch. Then we started purling. We alternated rows of knitting, then one row of purling in order to create the stocking stitch. And then we bound off and we explored changing the tension in the bind off. And so there you have it, the 4 key basic skills that you will use in your future knitting. Go forth and knit. After practicing a couple of samples, do be bold and go ahead and try out a couple of knitting projects. And please let me know what it is that you're going to be knitting next, or what it is that you're dreaming of knitting in the future. Make sure that you drop me a comment down below and let me know how you are doing on your knitting journey. I really hope that this tutorial has helped you. And if you enjoyed watching, do check out my channel for plenty more videos about how to knit, how to improve your knitting, and lots of ideas about different knitting projects. I also host a monthly knitting podcast where I share everything that I've been making, host conversations, and much, much more. And I approach making in the widest sense of the word, not just knitting, crochet, mending, and sewing, but also the kind of things that I'm making in my kitchen and garden. So if that sounds like something that you'd enjoy, do check out the Crimson Stitchery podcast as well here on YouTube. I'd like to take a moment to thank everybody who supports the Crimson Stitchery, and especially all of my beautiful and wonderful supporters over on Patreon. If you enjoy the Crimson Stitchery and you're looking to show your support whilst tapping into a fantastic community of like-minded crafty people, do consider joining us over on Patreon. There are various benefits, including access to a private Discord server where you can take part in discussions, knit-alongs, share your projects, get advice, and much, much more. If a monthly subscription is not your thing, you can also support the Crimson Stitchery by buying me a coffee over on Ko-fi, or simply by sharing this video with your friends. I hope that you have found this video tutorial helpful. That's everything from me today. Thanks so much for watching. Take care, happy knitting. Bye.